Isabella Montrose learned the language of wealth before she learned the language of want. It was spoken in quiet tones behind closed doors, in the rustle of silk gowns and the soft click of heels across marble floors. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the way servants entered rooms without sound and exited without acknowledgement. Wealth, she discovered early, was not loud. It did not announce itself. It assumed. Her childhood home sat behind iron gates that curved like calligraphy, guarded not only by security, but by distance itself. Visitors were announced days in advance. Even relatives felt like guests. The house smelled perpetually of polished wood and restrained perfume, as though emotion itself had been filtered out and replaced with elegance. Isabella grew up surrounded by beauty, paintings that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, chandeliers that scattered light like frozen fireworks, gardens trimmed with obsessive precision. Yet she often felt like a visitor in her own life, walking through rooms designed for display rather than living. From a young age, she understood expectations. At 7, she learned how to sit still for portraits, chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence, but not arrogance. At 10, she learned how to thank donors at charity luncheons with practiced warmth. At 14, she learned how to smile while adults discussed her future as though she were a business proposal rather than a child. "You'll inherit responsibility," her father once told her, straightening his cufflinks in the mirror. Not just money. Responsibility was a word that followed her everywhere, trailing behind her like a shadow she could never outrun. Her education was elite and exhaustive. Private tutors drilled languages into her memory: French, Italian, conversational Mandarin. Boarding schools polished her intellect while sanding down her rough edges. She learned to debate without offending, to disagree without disobeying, to lead without appearing to challenge. But no one taught her how to be lonely. Isabella discovered loneliness in moments no one else noticed. In the silence of her bedroom at night, where the walls were too wide and the ceilings too high, swallowing sound. In the back seat of chauffeured cars, watching families through tinted windows, parents arguing, laughing, touching, while she sat alone with her thoughts. Her friendships were fragile things. Girls gravitated toward her because of her name, her clothes, the doors she could open. Conversations often circled around envy disguised as admiration. "Your life must be perfect," they would say. Isabella learned to nod. What they did not see was how often she felt invisible beneath the attention. How people spoke at her instead of to her. How compliments slid off her like water because none of them touched who she actually was. At charity galas, she wore gowns tailored to perfection and smiled until her cheeks ached. She moved from group to group, shaking hands, listening to praise delivered with the subtle expectation of gratitude in return. "You're so generous," people said, even when she hadn't given a thing, only her presence. In those rooms, she felt like a symbol, an idea, never just a person. Her parents were not cruel. That truth complicated everything. They provided. They guided. They loved her in the way they understood love, through structure, through preparation, through ensuring she would never fall. But affection was expressed through planning rather than tenderness. Conversations revolved around investments, reputations, alliances. Her mother spoke often of appearances. Her father spoke often of legacy. Neither spoke of happiness. By her mid-20s, Isabella had mastered the art of performance. She knew when to speak, when to laugh, when to remain silent. She wore confidence like armor and elegance like skin. The world saw a woman who had everything: beauty, wealth, influence, security. What the world did not see was the quiet ache beneath it all. She felt it most strongly in moments of pause, when an event ended and the applause faded, when a room emptied and left her alone with herself. There was always a question waiting for her then, unspoken but insistent. Is this all there is? She tried to ignore it. She volunteered more, traveled farther, immersed herself in projects meant to give her life meaning. But fulfillment remained elusive, like something just out of reach. There were nights she stood by her bedroom window, looking down at the city lights beyond the gates, wondering how many lives existed out there. Messy, imperfect, real. How many people were allowed to fail, to struggle, to love without calculation? She envied them in a way that felt almost shameful. Wealth had given her safety, but it had also insulated her from authenticity. Everyone wanted something from her: money, influence, access. No one asked who she was when she wasn't useful. The thought unsettled her more with each passing year. By the time she turned 28, Isabella Montrose had inherited more than money. She had inherited expectations heavy enough to shape every decision, every relationship, every breath. She had inherited a world carefully built for her. And for the first time in her life, she wondered what it would mean to step outside of it, not knowing that somewhere beyond her gates, beyond her polished glass and guarded life, a man existed who owned nothing, but would one day see her in a way no one else ever had. Daniel Cruz learned early that life did not wait for permission. He woke before dawn, every morning without fail, to the sound of his phone alarm buzzing softly against the cracked wooden nightstand. The room he shared with his younger sister was small, the walls thin, the paint peeling in quiet surrender. He moved carefully, mindful not to wake her. Sleep was precious, and she needed it more than he did. Outside, the city stretched awake in fragments. Delivery trucks groaning into motion, streetlights flickering off one by one, the smell of damp concrete and brewing coffee drifting through open windows. Daniel pulled on his worn boots, laced them tight, and stepped into a day that would demand more from him than it ever promised to give back. Construction paid the bills. Barely. By 7 a.m., his hands were already coated in dust and grit, his muscles straining under loads that felt heavier each week. The work site was loud and relentless, metal clanging, men shouting over engines, foremen barking orders with clipped impatience. Daniel said little. He conserved his words the way others conserved money. The men around him joked crudely, complained loudly, cursed often. Daniel listened, nodded when necessary, and focused on the task in front of him. He had learned that dignity was not about being loud or dominant. It was about endurance. Every break, he checked his phone, not for messages, but for the time. Every minute mattered. When the shift ended, there was no rest waiting for him, only another obligation. The diner sat 3 blocks away from the bus stop, its neon sign flickering like it had something to prove. Inside, the air was thick with grease, coffee, and the constant hum of conversation. Daniel tied on his apron, nodded to the cook, and slipped seamlessly into a second version of himself, the polite server with steady hands and a calm voice. He remembered orders. He refilled cups. He smiled when customers snapped and apologized when mistakes weren't his. Tips varied. Some nights were good. Most were not. Between tables, his mind drifted to his sister, Sophia, 16, brilliant, stubborn, and determined to escape the cycle they'd been born into. Daniel saved for her textbooks, her exam fees, her future. He told himself it was temporary, that exhaustion was a phase, not a life sentence. But sometimes, late at night, when his legs ached and his back screamed in protest, doubt crept in. He had dreams once. Architecture, design, the idea of shaping spaces people lived in, worked in, belonged to. But dreams required time, money, and faith, 3 things Daniel rarely possessed at the same moment. Still, he carried himself with pride. It showed in the way he stood, shoulders straight despite the weight he carried. In the way he spoke to his sister, encouraging her to aim higher than he ever had. In the way he refused charity he hadn't earned. Life had not been kind, but it had taught him restraint. It had taught him to measure words, to observe more than he spoke, to survive without bitterness. That was why, when he saw the woman standing beside a sleek car stalled at the edge of a quiet street, he did not hesitate. She looked out of place, not in the way of arrogance, but uncertainty. Her posture was tense, her phone pressed to her ear as frustration edged her expression. The car itself was spotless, expensive, wrong for the neighborhood. Daniel paused. He had learned caution, learned that not every problem was his to fix. But he had also learned empathy, and something about the way she stood there, alone, clearly overwhelmed, pulled at him. "You need a hand?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, non-threatening. She turned, surprise flickering across her face before settling into guarded relief. "I think it's the battery," she said. "I've been waiting for roadside assistance, but they're delayed." Daniel glanced at the car, then at the street. It was getting darker. This wasn't the place you wanted to be stranded, not because it was dangerous, but because fear often exaggerated reality. I can take a look, he said. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. As he worked, Daniel noticed details without meaning to. Her shoes, simple but expensive. Her hands, manicured and used to grease. Her voice, carefully polite, as if she were used to choosing words that pleased. The car started with a soft cough. Her relief was immediate, genuine. "Thank you," she said, smiling fully now. "I don't know what I would have done." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You're welcome." She reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. Daniel shook his head before she could offer. "No need." That surprised her more than the breakdown had. "I insist." "I don't," he replied gently. "Just drive safe." She studied him then, really looked at him, as though enused to kindness without transaction. "I'm Isabella," she said. "Daniel." No last names. No explanations. They parted ways, but the encounter lingered in both of them longer than expected. Days later, she returned. This time, she didn't pretend coincidence. She found him at the diner near the end of his shift, standing awkwardly near the counter as though uncertain whether she belonged there. Daniel recognized her instantly. "You didn't have car trouble this time," he said, amused. She smiled, softer than before. "No, I was hoping you might join me for coffee." He hesitated. Time was precious. Money too. But something in her expression, curiosity mixed with vulnerability, made him say yes. They sat in a corner booth, steam curling from their mugs. She asked about his work. He answered honestly, but briefly. He asked about her interests. She spoke of books, travel, ideas, never money, never status. Daniel noticed what she avoided as much as what she said. Conversation came easily, surprisingly so. There was no pressure to impress, no unspoken hierarchy. Just two people talking as equals, even if the world outside insisted they were not. They began to meet like that, quietly, intentionally. Coffee shops without pretense. Walks through ordinary streets. Places where no one knew her name and no one looked twice at him. Daniel never asked why she had so much free time. Isabella never asked how he survived on so little. They existed in a fragile space between worlds, where labels fell away and only presence mattered. But even in those early days, Daniel sensed it, the imbalance. Not in the way she spoke or listened, but in the pauses, the things she left unsaid, the life she carefully kept just out of view. He did not push. Life had taught him that truths, when forced, often broke what they touched. Still, as affection grew quietly between them, Daniel felt a strange mix of hope and unease. He had learned to expect loss, to prepare for disappointment. And something about Isabella, her kindness, her curiosity, her unmistakable distance from his reality, felt like something beautiful that might not be meant to last. He did not know yet how deeply their worlds would collide. Only that, for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at him, not past him, not above him, but directly at him. And that was something he had never been prepared for. If there was a rule to what Isabella and Daniel were becoming, neither of them had learned it. Their meetings settled into a quiet rhythm, unannounced, unremarkable, and somehow essential. Coffee turned into long walks. Long walks turned into dinners at small places Daniel could afford without flinching, and Isabella could enter without being recognized. She learned the geography of his life in pieces, the bus routes he favored, the streets he avoided after dark, the way he counted money instinctively before ordering. Daniel, in turn, learned her habits. The way she tilted her head when listening closely. How she paused before answering questions about herself, as though sorting truth from safety. The way she laughed, unpracticed, unguarded, when something genuinely surprised her. They never named what was happening. Naming things gave them weight, and weight invited gravity. So they existed instead in a space that felt borrowed from time, temporary, delicate, real. Isabella stopped wearing expensive clothes when she met him, not because he asked, but because it felt dishonest. She chose simplicity, plain dresses, flats, hair tied back loosely. She wanted to arrive as herself, not as an emblem. Daniel noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he never commented, never tried to interpret her choices. Respect, he had learned, was often expressed in silence. They talked about everything except what mattered most. Isabella spoke about ideas, art she loved, books that unsettled her, questions she had about the world. She asked Daniel about his childhood, his sister, his dreams. He answered honestly, if selectively. He spoke of responsibility, of limits, of hope carefully rationed. He did not talk about envy. She did not talk about fear. Sometimes, when conversation lulled, they sat without speaking. Isabella had never known silence like this, comfortable, unpressured, free of expectation. In her world, silence demanded performance. Here, it simply existed. Yet beneath the ease, tension grew. Daniel felt it when she reached for the check too quickly, when she offered to pay and then stopped herself, unsure. He felt it when she spoke of travel casually, places she'd been that he'd only seen in pictures. She never boasted, never compared, but the difference lived between them anyway. Isabella felt it too, though differently. She noticed how Daniel calculated everything: time, money, effort. How spontaneity for him came at a cost. She saw the exhaustion he carried quietly, the way he masked pain with patience. And for the first time, guilt brushed against her privilege, sharp and unwelcome. She did not want to be his escape. She did not want him to feel lesser in her presence. And yet, the imbalance was undeniable. They were standing on opposite sides of a bridge neither had built. One evening, as they walked along a dimly lit street, Isabella slowed her steps. "Do you ever feel?" she began, then stopped. The question was too exposed. Daniel waited. "Do you ever feel like the world decided who you were before you got a say?" she asked instead. Daniel considered her carefully. "Every day." She exhaled, relief flickering across her face. "Me too." He smiled softly. "Different reasons." "Yes," she agreed. "Different reasons." The honesty between them deepened after that, subtly, steadily. They spoke more freely, challenged each other gently. Isabella admired Daniel's clarity, the way he saw systems instead of just symptoms. Daniel admired Isabella's curiosity, her refusal to accept inherited truths without question. Affection followed naturally, not dramatic, not urgent. It arrived quietly, through lingering looks, through the comfort of proximity, through the unspoken understanding that something meaningful was forming. But meaning invited risk. Daniel knew it, even as he leaned into it. He had lived long enough to recognize fragile things. And this, whatever it was, felt fragile. Not because of a lack of feeling, but because of too many forces pressing in from the outside. He began to notice what Isabella avoided. She never spoke of her family, never invited him into her world beyond the small bubble they shared. When her phone rang, she sometimes stepped away, voice lowering. There were moments, brief but telling, when worry crossed her face for reasons she didn't explain. Daniel did not accuse. He observed. And observation, when paired with affection, bred unease. One afternoon, they met at a cafe tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. The place smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. Isabella arrived flustered, her calm slightly cracked. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she said too quickly, then corrected herself. "I think so." He let it go, though the answer lingered. As they sat, Isabella noticed a magazine on the table behind Daniel, left behind by another customer. A business publication. Glossy. Familiar. She stiffened imperceptibly. Daniel followed her gaze. On the cover, a headline boasted about philanthropic leadership and generational wealth. Beneath it, a photograph. Isabella Montrose. The moment stretched thin. Daniel turned slowly, his eyes scanning the page. He recognized her immediately, though the woman staring back looked composed, untouchable, distant in a way Isabella never was with him. He didn't say anything at first. Isabella's chest tightened. This was it, the truth she had postponed, disguised, hoped to delay indefinitely. She opened her mouth, closed it again. "I can explain," she said finally. Daniel looked at her, not angry, not accusing, just recalibrating. "How much?" he asked quietly. She swallowed. Enough. The word landed heavily between them. He leaned back, the cafe noise rushing in to fill the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to," she said, voice trembling. Every time I tried, it felt like it would change everything." "And you thought it wouldn't come up?" His tone wasn't harsh. "Just tired." "I hoped," she admitted. "Selfishly." Daniel nodded slowly. So everything we talked about was real, she interrupted. Daniel, please. I never lied about who I am. I just didn't tell you everything. He studied her face, searching for something. Deceit, pity, distance. What he found unsettled him more. She looked afraid. Not of him, but of losing what they had. And that frightened him too. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The ease with money she tried to hide. The freedom of her schedule. The life she'd kept just out of reach. He felt exposed. Not because she was rich, but because he had been unaware. Uninformed. Unequal without consent. I need some time, he said at last. Isabella nodded, tears burning but unshed. I understand. They parted without drama, without raised voices. Just a quiet separation that felt heavier than any argument. In the days that followed, Daniel replayed every moment. Every conversation. Every silence. He questioned himself. Had he been naive? Had she been slumming? Was he a novelty? None of the answers satisfied him. Isabella, meanwhile, returned to her world, but it no longer fit. Galas felt louder. Conversations felt emptier. Faces felt unfamiliar. For the first time, she resented the life she had once accepted without question. She had crossed a line she could not uncross. And though neither of them knew it yet, the truth had not ended their story. It had only revealed what it would demand of them next. The truth did not explode when it arrived. It settled. That was the most unsettling part. Daniel expected anger, sharp, righteous, cleansing. Instead, what he felt was a slow, sinking weight, as though something inside him had shifted and he was still trying to find his balance. He went through his days distracted, his body moving on instinct while his mind replayed moments that now carried new meaning. At the construction site, the noise felt louder than usual. The men's laughter grated. Instructions blurred together. Daniel worked harder than he needed to, muscles burning as if pain could clarify what his thoughts would not. He told no one. There was no one to tell. At night, after his shift at the diner, he sat alone in the break room long after the last table had been cleared. The smell of disinfectant clung to the air. He stared at his hands, calloused, scarred, real, and wondered when they had begun to feel insufficient. It wasn't envy. He was certain of that. He didn't resent Isabella's wealth. He resented the sudden awareness of how easily the world bent around her. How many choices she had never had to calculate. How many risks she could afford to take without consequence. And how unaware he had been of the imbalance between them. The magazine cover haunted him. Not because it showed her riches, but because it showed a version of her he had never met. A woman polished into something symbolic, something untouchable. It made him question whether the intimacy they shared had been real or merely selective. He replayed her words. I never lied about who I am. Hadn't she? Daniel had always believed that honesty was not just about truth, but timing. About allowing the other person the dignity of knowing what they were choosing. He wondered if he would have chosen differently. The thought unsettled him. Isabella, on the other hand, was unraveling in a quieter way. She returned to her parents' estate one evening, the iron gates opening as they always had. But instead of comfort, the sight filled her with something closer to dread. The house seemed larger now, emptier in a way she couldn't ignore. At dinner, conversation revolved around upcoming events, potential partnerships, the inevitable suggestion of introductions, men who were appropriate, accomplished, safe. She listened, nodded, smiled when expected. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing Daniel's face when he'd turned the magazine toward her. The hurt he hadn't voiced. The restraint that felt heavier than anger ever could. She had told herself she was protecting what they had by staying silent. Now she wondered if she had only protected herself. That night, she stood in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by things she had outgrown. Trophies, framed photos, evidence of a life carefully curated. None of it reflected who she had become. She realized something then, with clarity that left her breathless. For the first time in her life, she had been chosen for who she was, not for her name, not for her resources, not for her usefulness. And she had risked losing that by being afraid. The weeks passed without contact. Daniel threw himself into routine, into work, into responsibility. He told himself that walking away was the mature choice, the dignified one. That love, no matter how genuine, could not erase reality. But absence did not dull feeling. It sharpened it. He missed her questions, her curiosity, the way she listened without trying to fix him. He missed the way she existed in his world without judgment, even if she had never fully belonged to it. Still, pride kept him silent. He had spent his life standing on his own. He would not start leaning now. Isabella broke first. She found him where she had first truly met him, not the diner, but the quiet park nearby where they had once sat for hours, talking about nothing and everything. She arrived uncertain, dressed simply, nerves tight in her chest. Daniel was there, seated on a bench, staring at the city beyond the trees. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his face, quickly masked by composure. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," she replied. They sat in silence, the air between them dense with things unsaid. "I should have told you," Isabella said finally. "Not because I owed you my wealth, but because I owed you honesty." Daniel nodded. "Yes." She flinched at the simplicity of his agreement. "I didn't want to be treated differently," she continued. "I didn't want to be your money, or your opportunity, or your escape. I just wanted to be me. And I just wanted to be enough," Daniel said quietly. The words landed heavily. "I never saw you as less," she said immediately. "I know," he replied. "That's not the problem." She waited. "The problem," he continued, "is that I didn't get to decide how much difference mattered." Isabella swallowed hard. "You're right." She reached into her bag, pulled out nothing, no offers, no solutions. "Just truth. I don't want to hide anymore," she said. "And I don't want you to feel like you're standing in my shadow." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. She was not asking him to step into her world. She was asking him to meet her in the open. Still, fear lingered. "I don't want to be a project," he said. "Or a statement." "You're not," she replied. "You never were." They talked then, not carefully, but honestly. About money. About power. About how society measures worth. About fear. Hers of being used, his of being diminished. There were no promises made that evening. No grand declarations. Only understanding. When they parted, something had shifted, not repaired, not resolved, but acknowledged. The truth had not ended them, but it had stripped away illusion. They both knew the hardest part was yet to come. Because loving each other now would require more than feeling. It would require choice. And choice, they were beginning to understand, always came at a cost. Time did not heal what had been exposed. Instead, it tested it. Daniel returned to his routines with renewed intensity, as if discipline could quiet the thoughts that refused to settle. He arrived earlier at the construction site, stayed later at the diner, volunteered for extra shifts whenever they were offered. Fatigue became a companion he understood better than uncertainty. But exhaustion had a way of peeling back defenses. Some nights, as he lay awake listening to the hum of traffic outside his apartment window, his mind drifted to Isabella, her questions, her silences, the way she had looked at him in the park, not asking to be saved, not offering to save him either. Just asking to be seen. He wondered if walking away truly meant strength, or if it was simply fear dressed up as pride. Reality pressed in on him from every angle. Rent was due. Sophia's school fees were rising. A minor injury at work forced him to miss 2 days of pay, days he could not afford to lose. The world reminded him, relentlessly, that love did not pay bills. And yet, love refused to stay irrelevant. Isabella faced her own reckoning. She attended galas, fundraisers, board meetings, spaces that once felt familiar, now unbearably hollow. The conversations repeated themselves endlessly, echoing without meaning. Men with impressive resumes and polished smiles were introduced to her with thinly veiled expectation. "Just consider him," her mother would say. "He understands your world," her father would add. But Isabella had seen another world now, one that measured people by effort rather than inheritance, by integrity rather than influence. And she could not unsee it. She found herself questioning everything. The investments she approved, the charities she supported, the power structures she had once accepted as inevitable. For the first time, her wealth felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility she had never fully confronted. Daniel's words lingered in her mind. "I just wanted to be enough." She realized how rarely she had considered what enough meant outside of her world. They met again by chance, or perhaps by inevitability, on a crowded street near the diner. The city pulsed around them, indifferent to the quiet collision of two lives still unfinished. "Hi," Isabella said, surprised but steady. "Hi," Daniel replied. There was no awkwardness, only restraint. They walked together without deciding to, talked without planning to. The conversation was careful at first, then slowly loosened. "I've been thinking," Daniel said at last. "About what you said. About meeting in the open." Isabella waited. "I don't want to be angry about things I can't change," he continued. "But I also don't want to pretend they don't matter." "I don't either," she said. "I want us to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable." They stopped walking. Daniel looked at her, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. "Then we need to be realistic." She nodded. Yes. Realism was not romantic. It did not promise easy endings. It demanded clarity. They spoke of logistics, time, finances, expectations. They spoke of boundaries. They spoke of the invisible pressures that would follow them if they chose each other openly. Daniel admitted his fear of losing autonomy. Isabella admitted her fear of being resented. Neither tried to fix the other's fears. They simply acknowledged them. Weeks turned into months. They did not rush back into what they had been. Instead, they rebuilt something new, slower, sturdier, deliberate. They met in each other's worlds without pretending those worlds were the same. Isabella visited Daniel's neighborhood, his diner, his reality. She listened more than she spoke. She learned where help was welcome and where it was intrusive. Daniel attended events with Isabella, not as an accessory, not as a secret. He wore his discomfort honestly. He observed how easily people assumed things about him, and how Isabella corrected them without spectacle. They argued. About money. About pride. About when to step in and when to step back. But they did not retreat. Love, they discovered, was not proven in ease, but in endurance. Daniel applied for a night program in engineering, something he had postponed for years. Not because Isabella encouraged it, but because he allowed himself to want more again. Isabella redirected parts of her investments, not out of guilt, but intention. She stopped donating for recognition and started funding change that aligned with her values. Their growth did not erase the gap between them. It reframed it. They learned that love did not mean equality of circumstance, but equality of voice. That choosing each other did not mean abandoning who they were, but confronting it honestly. One evening, as they sat quietly on Daniel's apartment steps, Isabella spoke the thought she had been carrying for weeks. "I don't want to rescue you," she said. "And I don't want to be punished for what I was born into." Daniel considered this, then nodded. "I don't want either of those things." She exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. They leaned into each other, not in desperation, not in illusion, but in resolve. Reality had tested their affection and found it wanting illusion, but not substance. The question now was not whether they loved each other. It was whether they were willing to choose that love, fully aware of what it would cost. Choosing love was not a single moment. It was a series of decisions, small and unglamorous, made again and again in the face of pressure that did not announce itself loudly, but wore down resolve quietly. For Isabella, the pressure came wrapped in familiarity. It appeared in polite conversations over breakfast, in calendar invitations she did not schedule, in introductions framed as coincidence but carefully arranged. Her parents never demanded obedience outright. They didn't need to. Expectation lived in every word, every pause. "You've been distant," her mother observed one evening, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "We worry." Isabella recognized the coded language. Worry meant deviation. Deviation meant risk. "I've been thinking," Isabella replied calmly. Her father looked up from his plate. "About what?" "About what I want my life to stand for." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. "You've always understood what's expected of you," her father said at last. "You carry a responsibility beyond yourself." Isabella nodded. "I know, but responsibility doesn't mean surrender." They exchanged looks, concern mixed with something closer to disappointment. Then came the suggestion, presented gently, as though it were a kindness. "There's someone we'd like you to meet," her mother said. "A man with vision, stability, a future that aligns with yours." Isabella felt the old reflex rise, the urge to comply, to smooth tension, to postpone conflict. But something inside her had changed. "I'm already seeing someone," she said. The admission felt like stepping into open air. Her parents reacted as she had expected, questions disguised as curiosity, concerns framed as protection. What does he do? Where is he from? Does he understand your world? Isabella answered honestly, without embellishment or apology. The room cooled. This isn't practical, her father said finally. Love isn't enough. I know, Isabella replied. That's why I'm choosing it carefully. Daniel faced pressure of a different kind. His came without polish, raw, immediate, unfiltered. His sister worried. His co-workers questioned. His friends, few as they were, watched with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. Be careful, Sophia warned him one night. People like her don't live in our world. Daniel smiled faintly. Neither do I anymore. He wasn't naive. He knew what people saw when they looked at Isabella, and what they assumed when they looked at him standing beside her. He felt the weight of scrutiny in rooms not designed for him. Felt the unspoken questions pressing in. Is he here for the right reasons? Does he belong? He answered none of them aloud. The true test came quietly. Isabella offered him help, not dramatic, not patronizing. An introduction, a resource, a financial safety net he hadn't asked for, but undeniably needed. Daniel considered it for days. He thought about exhaustion, about missed opportunities, about pride and where it crossed into self-sabotage. He thought about equality, not as sameness, but as autonomy. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I can't accept money, he said, but I can accept support that doesn't erase my effort. Isabella smiled, not in relief, but in respect. Together, they found a middle ground. Scholarships earned, not gifted. Mentorship without obligation. Support without ownership. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They stopped hiding. Isabella attended Daniel's graduation ceremony, sitting among families who clapped with unrestrained pride. Daniel attended Isabella's foundation meeting, speaking not as a beneficiary, but as a contributor. Each stepped into the other's world without trying to dominate it. There were moments of doubt, arguments sparked by misunderstanding, tension born of fatigue, days when the gap between them felt wide and stubborn. But there was also growth. Daniel completed his engineering studies, balancing work and education with relentless determination. Isabella redirected her influence, refusing projects that clashed with her values, embracing those that aligned with the future she envisioned. They learned to speak plainly, to say this hurts, this scares me, this matters, without accusation. One evening, as they stood on a quiet overlook watching the city glow below them, Isabella broke the silence. They'll never fully approve, she said. Daniel nodded. I know. Are you okay with that? He considered the question, not lightly, but honestly. Yes, he said. Because I didn't choose this to be accepted. I chose it to be real. She reached for his hand, grounding herself in the warmth of it. I choose you, she said, not as a promise of ease, but as a declaration of intent. Daniel met her gaze. I choose us. It wasn't romantic in the way stories often were. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic renunciations. Just two people standing in the open, fully aware of what they were stepping into. Choosing each other, not despite reality, but in full acknowledgement of it. Years later, the city had learned their names together. Not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet partnership that reshaped spaces people thought were forgotten. The first project was small, too small, some said, to justify the attention Isabella gave it. A neglected block of apartments on the edge of the city, roofs leaking, hallways dim, residents invisible to policy and progress alike. Isabella funded it. Daniel redesigned it. They worked side by side. Daniel walked the site with blueprints rolled under his arm, listening to tenants describe what they needed rather than what they had been promised before. Isabella attended meetings not as a benefactor, but as a student, learning the difference between charity and investment, between giving and empowering. The buildings changed slowly. So did the people who lived there. Children played in courtyards that had once been unsafe. Families stayed instead of drifting. Pride replaced resignation. Success followed. Not loud, not viral, but undeniable. Daniel became known for designs that prioritized dignity. Isabella became known for backing projects that refused shortcuts. Together, they earned something neither wealth nor struggle alone could buy: trust. Their home reflected that philosophy. It was modest by Isabella's former standards, generous by Daniel's earlier ones. Light filled the rooms. Books lined the walls. There were no gates, no staff hovering at the edges of life. Friends came and went freely. Laughter lingered. In the evenings, they cooked together, arguing gently over spices, music playing softly in the background. There were bills to manage, schedules to coordinate, disagreements to navigate. There was also peace. Sophia graduated with honors, her future wide open. She hugged Isabella fiercely, gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. Daniel watched from a distance, pride swelling in his chest, not for what he had provided, but for what had been made possible. Isabella's parents softened with time. Not fully, not completely, but enough. They saw the results, the tangible change, the fulfillment in their daughter's eyes, the integrity in the man she had chosen. Approval came not as validation, but as reluctant respect. And that was enough. On a quiet morning, years after that first stalled car, Isabella stood by the window of their home, watching the city wake. Daniel joined her, coffee in hand, familiar warmth at her side. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The old world." She considered the question. "I miss certainty," she said honestly. "But not comfort." Daniel smiled. "I don't miss struggle, but I don't miss being unseen either." They stood in silence, the kind that no longer felt empty. Love had not erased their differences. It had integrated them. They had learned that wealth was not what insulated you from the world, but what anchored you to it. That power was not control, but responsibility. That equality was not sameness, but mutual recognition. The city outside buzzed with life, imperfect, persistent, real. And in choosing each other, again and again, Isabella and Daniel had built something that neither inheritance nor hardship could have produced alone. A life not defined by what they had been given, but by what they chose to create. Yindi.